About 6 years ago, I created a generic nullification resolution for state legislatures. It's really a 3-page resolution. I didn't have to make any word of it up. I just took it from the consummate nullification gurus, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And I compiled it together in a 3-page document. And then there's another page at the end that there's 25 key points of nullification that if you're interested in, that I think will, it's a totally different concept than the way most people perceive the subject. Because honestly, the people that are the discounters always try and throw things at you that are totally untrue. They could not be more untrue. The idea of this as being associated with slavery, well, yeah, that's true in a sense, because nullification was used back in the day when there was that horrid institution of slavery to fight slavery. Nullification was not pro-slavery. And then you get the people that say, well, James Madison was against nullification. What a falsehood. But he did come out when South Carolina was doing their nullification effort back in the 1820s, and he was against it then. And there's a reason why, and you'll understand that better. I hope I remember to say something when we get to that point in the presentation, that if you really want to know how Madison felt about nullification, get his 1834 notes on nullification, and you'll quickly dispel that concept. It is soundly founded, it is constitutional, it is natural law at its just grandest state. So anyway, I've got copies of those up here for you. I put it out 6 years ago. I have not found a state legislator with enough guts yet to propose it. They all have no backbones, it seems, and I don't know if I can make that as a blanket statement, but it seems like I run into more of my share than I should, that are unwilling to stand up for the things that have been lost because we are unwilling to say no to the federal government. So I gave it to my legislature, and this was, like I say, 6 years ago, and nobody did anything with it. And so I contacted the legislator I'd given it to, and he says, well, it's too long. 3 pages, I said. How long's Obamacare? Well, nobody understands it. And so I thought, well, it is Jefferson and Madison's words, and maybe most legislators today have a trouble stringing a sentence together. But nevertheless, I said, well, just a minute. So I gave it to my wife. Now, my wife she was a homeschooling mother, and then now she's a homeschooling grandmother. So she had to learn how to think. I says, read this and tell me what you think about this. I didn't give her any preface, or I didn't prime the pump at all. She came back, and it was like she was doing handsprings and just so excited about it. She said, can we do this? This is, wow. And I said, whoa, just a minute. I said, do you understand it? She said, yes. I said, did you read it? She said, yes. And I says, you read it, and so you understood it, right? She said, yes. I said, okay, well, that's what's happening. There's our legislators are not willing to read 3 pages for crying out loud. But it is a generic model that you just fill in the blanks, your state and whatever you're trying to overcome, and it goes from there. And it's all Jefferson and Madison, principal author of the Declaration of Independence and the father of the Constitution. So it's soundly founded, and it's based upon when it was first kind of rolled out, if you will, in 1798. So if you get a chance and you're interested, we've only got 20 copies here. We'll make more if there's more interest. But our thought was, a lot of people aren't going to go kind of make a run at their legislator and try and get this to happen, but maybe some of you will. So there's some copies up here if you want to get them afterwards. All right, what we're going to say about this is that I need to cover a few baseline principles, first of all. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with nullification? I mean, it's foundational to the fact that we, the people, and the states have a place in the national government. And we've lost it largely because of apathy and the fact that there's been some horrid amendments that have been made. But we need to understand these principles. First of all, is the fact that God is the source of our rights. For many years, decades in fact, I've been a Boy Scouts of America Citizenship in the Nation Merit Badge. Every single Boy Scout that's ever come before me, in an effort to get that Citizenship in the Nation Merit Badge, I've asked this question too: where do we get our rights? And every single one of them, in all those decades, except for one, answered it incorrectly. See, they're educated in a system, almost all of them say, almost all of them, probably 98% of them at least, say from the government. And the corollary to that's kind of a sad story, because if they give them to you, they can take them away, okay? And then some that have thought a little more deeply say the Declaration or the Constitution. They're both wrong, because the absolute truth of this is that God is the source of our rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator. Creator, just right there in one sentence, is mentioned twice, okay? They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay, it mentions a few, and then it says the purpose of government is to secure those rights. See, a lot of times when I talk to legislators, they say, what's your job? They say, well, we have a pretty tough job. We have all these programs we have to fulfill, and we get money in, and it's never enough. We do a pretty good job of dividing it up and getting it out, but it's just a hard job. No, you don't get it. Your job is to preserve God-given rights. And if you have to spend money to do that, well, so be it. But if you're just taking money and redistributing it, that is not your job. That's Marxist in philosophy. So, and you'll see maybe, I hope in a minute, how these things all apply to nullification. We have a written Constitution. It's written in plain English. In those words that are in English, their meanings can be known, and those meanings can only be what they meant in the day they were written. You cannot redefine them over time and say, oh, now they mean this. No, they didn't mean that. How could the founders, oh, it's a living document. Oh, come on, we won't go off on that tangent for a while. If you believe that, we have no Constitution. And the Founding Fathers gave us a written one because this kind of scooch it along kind of Constitution wasn't working out so good with them and the king. Because see, the king could make their constitution anything by decree. Parliament could do it. It could change by court cases, anything. They wanted a written contract, and that's what they got. And all of them that came into office are required to take an oath, a sacred oath. And we could take a lot of time on an oath right now, but we don't have time, okay? And then they enumerated the powers. They listed them. There are no other powers granted or delegated to the national government than what is in there right there. And I'm just giving you this. You'll see that I'm not making this up. The Founding Fathers said this very specifically. There are checks and balances that are to prevent the overrunning of power. See, this Constitution was not written to be only good for a certain period of time and technology would overcome it. It has nothing whatsoever. It's technology agnostic. See, what happens is that the founders knew that government was power. They knew that human nature was to obtain, accrue, and then begin to abuse power. And so it's agnostic to any technology, and it's simply human nature that it's addressing. And they knew that certain powers had to be delegated to a national government, and any government for that matter, but they had to be within limited bounds, and they had to have ways of stopping it, okay? So there were checks and balances that were built into ours. They were separated and divided the power. In fact, they were so concerned about power, they divided and subdivided the sources of power. Now, we fouled that up with the 17th Amendment, for example, but if you read Federalist 39, you'll find out how they divide. So there was no source of power that would become kind of overwhelming within the government. And if we ever get rid of the Electoral College, for example, that will be another nail in the Republic that will put it in the ground. Because honestly, the sources of power become so overwhelmingly powerful, and we've lost to the people. The House was always with the people, but the Senate was with the states, and that was a horrific mistake. That was the 17th Amendment that changed that. Now the states are no longer represented at the national government. That's one of the reasons we have such a big problem as we do now. But so the people have two houses, and if the people get the third house in the presidency, it will be so close to a democracy we won't be able to hardly tell the difference. But I'm getting far afield, and I know my time is limited. Somebody's going to have to signal me when I'm done. Because if we had 4 or 5 hours, we'd just get warmed up, I'm telling you. It's too much fun. Anyway, So we divided and subdivided the power, and those powers may not be redelegated. This is constitutional protocol. You can look at John Locke, for example, or Thomas Jefferson, or St. George Tucker. By the way, I'll mention Tucker a few times in this presentation. In my opinion, Tucker was probably the preeminent constitutional scholar of the founding era. This man, if you haven't read his works, you are woefully ignorant. I'm sorry to tell you that. But that's the way it is. We've got to stand with the principle, and he was so lucid in what he spoke about. And just this idea of the not redelegating power. If the Constitution gave power by the power of the voice of the people to this, let's say the legislature, this authority to go to war, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, that cannot be redelegated from the legislature. It simply can't be. They can't give it to the president. They can't give it through a treaty to an international body. They can't give it away to anybody. They either exercise it or they do not. That is the constitutional protocol. And we, because of ignorance, have largely forgotten that in the nation, and that's why we are in such a mess in so many ways, but you can't redelegate. Okay, what about this idea of the so-called Supremacy Clause? I mean, you guys maybe haven't ever met this guy, hopefully not, but Joseph Goebbels was the propaganda chief guy for the Nazi war machine. And this is an English translation. It says, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. We have told this idea that the United States Constitution's Supremacy Clause is there and is supreme over all things. And I say, really? Can they tell you what color shoelaces to wear? How many children to have? If you're going to put a chain link fence or a picket fence up, or what color your roof's going to be? I mean, I start naming things. They go, well, don't be ridiculous. Well, if it's supreme, and you, in the way you say, it's supreme. And that's not the case. It simply is not, and we'll explain that just momentarily. This is what it says in Article 6, Clause 2. I have the date that it was signed, September 17th, 1787. That is the Supremacy Clause. This Constitution, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. We'll leave the treaties for another time. We can debunk that idea anytime you want, because treaties are not supreme. Absolutely, unequivocally, we can prove it by the words of the Founding Fathers. Oh, here I go on a tangent again. We can prove it by the words of the Founding Fathers, and we can prove it by Supreme Court cases if you have to go that low, okay? But the fact of the matter is, it says it's the supreme law of the land. Bradley, you're a constitutionalist. Don't you believe the words of the Constitution, the plain English words that you're always... Okay. Well, let's just say they meant it was going to be supreme in everything, and they could tell you what color shoelaces you're going to wear, how many kids you're going to have, and your chain link fence, all that stuff we said, which none of us believe. Okay, we don't believe that they have the power to do that. But these people that are the supremacists would have us believe that they can tell us to do anything and everything. Well, I'm going to say that only laws made in conformance to the Constitution, with the limits and bounds thereof, would be supreme. So within its jurisdiction, the Constitution is supreme. See, some of our friends, by the way, that want a Constitution convention, and I look at their proposals, and by the way, I'm adamantly, unequivocally, and totally and completely, did I emphasize that enough? Opposed to any kind of convention under any name, because I cannot, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is, who's going to be there? You tell me which of the Founding Fathers will be there. I guarantee absolutely there will not be one. And you know who's going to be there? It'll be the yo-yos that got us in trouble that we're in right now. And you're going to give them the keys to the Constitution? You've got to be kidding me. And if you think the states will do any better, holy cow. How many of you here from California? Oh, no, never mind. Okay, sorry. All right. They're probably going to have to edit a whole bunch of this, I'm afraid. But at any rate, so the area of jurisdiction is all they're supreme in. They are supreme in no other thing. And what I got off on this with the people that are now in favor of changing our Constitution, they want to go back, in many of the instances, to what was had under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, it was a failure formula for a nation that was to be as great as our nation is. And we found that many of the things that the states had override power on, they should not. There are certain things that only the national government should be involved in, and the states do not have that. We delegated that part to them, and it's been very successful. those that want a Constitution Convention also almost always want to take some of that back to the states, that in fact, there'll be a lot of instances where the states will override things that should be in the national purview. And I'll give you an example out of Federalist 45 in just a second. Okay, so the Constitution doesn't create an overarching authority to usurp power. It does not. Here's what Madison, father of the Constitution, said. He said this at the ratifying convention for Virginia in 1788. Does it follow because a power is given to Congress, meaning the supremacy power, it is absolute and unlimited? The exercise of the power must be consistent with the object of the delegation. It's just logical, people. If you're given a power, it isn't all-encompassing. It's only for the reason it was given. And we're going to see how Judge Roberts really blew it in his case about Obama in a minute. Obamacare, I guess I should say. Probably some other Obama things too. But at any rate, fact of the matter is that everything that's done has to be consistent with why it was done. And you can't make these blanket sweeping things, and you've got to go back and look at the original intent of the founders. Okay, by the way, I showed you back here, well, I won't go back that far. The September 17, 1787 is when the Constitution was signed. In this arduous ratification process that they had, it became apparent that the Constitution was not going to be ratified, because everybody kept saying, including 3 of the men that had sat through the entire convention, said, we're not signing this thing until we get a Bill of Rights. When James Madison sent Jefferson a copy of it in Paris, where he was the ambassador after the convention signed the document, Jefferson said, well, here's some things I like about it, and here's some things I don't like about it. The primarily was the fact that it didn't have a Bill of Rights. And the argument was, well, we didn't give the national government enough power to take any rights. And they said, yeah, but we want a Bill of Rights. Yeah, but if we try listing our rights, if we leave one off legally, they say you left it off on purpose. We still want a Bill of Rights. Anyway, the argument went back and forth until it became apparent it was not going to be ratified. Then the noble founders said, okay, right. Okay, we get it. Sign the Constitution as written, and our first order of business will be to put together a Bill of Rights for you. Okay, so with that commitment, they did. When Congress gathered, they got 189 suggestions. A lot of them were replications. They boiled them down to 17. They debated those 17. They passed 12 of them with the 2/3 margin required in Article 5. They sent those out to the states on the 25th of September, 1789, and said, here's what we're offering to you as a Bill of Rights. Okay? They sent a preamble with that. And they basically said, some of you guys said that when you were ratifying this, that we needed to have something to make sure that there was no opportunity at all, no wiggle room at all for the national government to overstep anything. So they said, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. None of these restricted the people or the states. They were against the national government. And the Bill of Rights did not create any rights. They predate kings, parliaments, potentates, constitutions, declarations, and everything else like that. They're God-given, remember that, okay? So if you're ever before me as a Boy Scout looking for that merit badge, you know the answer. Okay, so they were saying we need further declaratory and restrictive clauses put on that, and that's what the Bill of Rights were. And so the amendments were. So the 9th Amendment said basically the people retain all their rights, even if we didn't list them. So they overcame that one objection that was out there that we couldn't possibly list them all. They didn't include your shoelaces in there, or the number of your children, or anything like that. Everything is open. It's yours. You didn't lose any rights, okay, even if we didn't mention them. And then the 10th Amendment put a period and an exclamation point there and says, if we didn't give the national government power, it does not have it. If it wasn't enumerated in the document, you do not have that power. So the Supremacy Clause only grants the national government the power in its jurisdiction. And we'll find here in just a minute in the 45th Federalist what they really meant. So it doesn't create this overarching power. It's not there. Here's what James Madison said. A law violating the Constitution established by the people themselves would be considered by the judges null and void. That was said during the convention. Oh, how naive he was. Now, I'm not going to call fault James Madison. Magnificent, brilliant, sparkling mind. He had hope that we would have honorable judges. unfortunately, much of that has been lost in our day, and it's been happening for decades and even centuries. But the fact of the matter is, he thought the judges will look at the words and they'll say, hey, this doesn't apply, we can't do it. No, okay, it hasn't happened. So this James Madison guy in Federalist 45 that I've been alluding to, this is, the Federalist Papers, as you know, were written to assist in the ratification of the United States Constitution. Okay, they were written for the newspapers, by the way. And us common folk would read them in the newspapers, not so much anymore. But in those days, the people understood them. And so he said in Federalist 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution of the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects. So external objects, war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Okay, if you want to go back to the Articles of Confederation, you'll give the states some of the power in that. And it just wasn't working under the Articles of Confederation. Okay? But this thing about foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will be for the most part connected, isn't that interesting? This idea of ex posts and imposts and all those taxes and all those kind of things like that on imports, that's a constitutional tax. They were intending to run the entire United States government off of that. There's a thought today, huh? They did for a while too, didn't they? No question about it. Going on with Federalist 45, the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So the stuff with the state is out there. The national government does not touch that stuff, contrary to what we're doing nowadays. And in Federalist 39, when Madison wrote about the limits on the federal government in the Constitution, he said, its jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only, and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. Okay, now, can you see how this is foundational to nullification? This was not something that somebody started to invent in 1962. I mean, this has been around. Tucker, here's Tucker. The powers vested in Congress, the privileges of the members in each house are severally enumerated in the Constitution. Consequently, it would appear that they were not capable of extension beyond the letter of the Constitution itself. The 10th Amendment, that's in brackets because it would have been the 12th Amendment had all 12 of those amendments been ratified. But the first two were not, and we'll talk about that sometime if you're interested. Fascinating story there. But at any rate, to the Constitution seems not only to favor a constructive extension of the powers of the federal government or any department thereof. So you can't even manufacture anything else. You can't do it based upon this. Madison is a member of the House in 1792, rose on the floor and said, I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those who proposed the Constitution conceived. It is still more fully known and more material to observe that those who ratified the Constitution conceived that this is not an indefinite government, deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to the specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms. It's not something that you can pick and choose or just go out. It's there and that's all it is. Tucker again, it's a written contract. Government was reduced to its elements. Its object was defined. Its principles ascertained. Its powers limited and fixed. How much more definitive can we get on this thing? Okay, then we come into 1798. The Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, egregious acts that violated, overstepped the Constitution. It violated, let's just take the First Amendment, for example. You could be put in jail for criticizing the government. Can you imagine? Holy cow. Anyway, and so a couple of states got together. Well, they didn't get together initially, but they had two guys that got together, Madison and Jefferson. They both collaborated on both the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Okay, so here's what in the Kentucky resolution it said, that the several states composing, this is so succinct, I got to read you the whole thing. It's so eloquent, it's so powerful. That the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but that by a compact meaning a contract, under the style and title of a Constitution of the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself. Do you see the logic here? You can't turn it over to them and let them decide what they can do with it. It's a contract that they take an oath to uphold, okay? Since that would have made its discretion, and not the Constitution, the measure of its powers, but that, as in all other cases of compact among powers having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. So the founders, as I said earlier, were very concerned about power and how they divided and subdivided it. Well, individuals were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And by that nature of the fact that they had this independence granted to them by God, they created states. And from those states, those states went forward and created a national government. But when that national government was created, it was divided into 3 different departments: legislative, executive, and judicial, each with independent powers and responsibilities that were to check and balance each other. And all of the entities retained power within their specific jurisdiction to do as they needed to do. Okay, now I put together a slide actually about some of these egregious examples of where the charter's been violated, but you know what? We didn't have 16 or 20 hours to go through just my list. It's amazing, but the violations are just overwhelming. The Constitution is not being abided by. So how can we correct these violations? There are 4 constitutional means to do this. One is repeal the offending matter in the National Congress. They created it, they can take it down. Article 1, Section 7, go read it. It tells you how a bill is passed. Starts in a house, goes to the other house, then goes to the president. When it's the same bill, the president vetoes, send it back, 2/3 majority can override, okay? That's in Article 1, Section 7. You can defund it, so it can't be carried out. If they don't send money, it don't happen. That's just the way it is. You don't pay your money, it doesn't happen. So how did that happen? Well, Article 1, Section 7, again, requires all the funds be expended by the national government be approved by Congress. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 requires that you can't spend money unless there's been legislative appropriation. So what's the deal? Congress controls the nation's money, not the executive. Okay? Now we all know how well they've been doing that. Okay. So how can we correct the violations? Point number 3, the courts. Well, there's a thought. Well, in 2012 and 15, we found Supreme Court decisions, and I just took the Obamacare. I thought you guys might be familiar with this. At any rate, they dashed our hopes that this egregious violation would be set aside. But you know what? Justice Roberts, in his, well, I'll just kind of read what here. He justified his decision based upon the fact, he said, the power to tax is granted in the national government within the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, so we can tax anything and everything. Okay, we've had enough stuff we've been going through here to know that I've taught this stuff to people that were 5 years old, and they can understand this. But our black-robed judges do not understand this. Anyway, going on, and again, going back to Madison, does it follow because of powers given to Congress that is absolute and unlimited? The exercise of the power must be consistent with the object of the delegation. And then that hope he had that the people bringing forth the Constitution, judges would honor that. So the Supreme Court, the legislature, the executive, all of them have fallen away from the Constitution. So the 4th option is nullification by state legislatures. It was a doctrine that has been held since the beginning of this country. And in spite of what people that are against this, and the reason they're against it, by the way, and I'll just lightly touch on this here, is because it takes away from them every justification they have for having a convention. Because the idea is not one item or another. Their idea is to have the keys to the Constitution. And again, I cannot think of any person on this earth at this time, no mortal individual, would I trust with the keys to the Constitution. So, if you want my opinion, I'll give it to you. Anyway, so nullification has been around since the beginning, and it is a natural right that's recognized in the Declaration. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, which is maintaining our God-given rights and being able to have their power, the consent of the governed, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Again, in the Declaration, it's their duty to throw off such a government. Again, by the way, when they wrote the Declaration, the first few paragraphs, last few paragraphs, they're kind of the substance of the document in terms of the eloquence and the statesman-like things. The 27 offenses of the king in the middle give justification to those things. This is one of those offenses of the king. He's subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Everything that happens outside the bounds of our Constitution is foreign to our Constitution. I read the Declaration of Independence personally as today's news today. And it's astounding, the parallels between what's in there and what is there. By the way, there's two things that we have that they didn't have before they went to revolution. One was we have the Constitution. The other is we have the vote. We still have those foundational principles if we will become wise enough to exercise them. So don't go out and do revolution right now, okay? But the fact of the matter is, this acts of pretended legislation, Article 1, Section 1, all legislative authority herein granted. Who's granted that?
The Congress.
Congress only. House and the Senate. Absolutely. Does the President have any legislative authority? Does the Supreme Court? Does any? No. Administrative bodies in the executive branch don't either. None of them do. All legislative authorities in the House and the Senate. So anything that comes out of any of those other bodies is pretended legislation, just like the king used to do. It's astonishing how we've got that. He's fundamentally altered the forms of our government by taking away the ability of the states to run their own sovereignty within their states. So this right of refusal is retained constitutionally by natural law by the states. They created it. Okay, so there was many instances in the founding era it was considered. It was regularly exercised in the 1800s, particularly against slavery. This is not, in fact, nullification is an act of love to be able to preserve the Union. And by the way, if you get my little document here, you'll find these 25 points and everything. And it really, Jefferson and Madison talked about it. They want the Union to be retained. But if you keep pushing this, guys, people are going to break off. By the way, who was the first group that wanted to break out of the Union and secede? Massachusetts. Anybody here from Massachusetts? You guys didn't know you're so revolutionary and so on, did you? At any rate. Okay, so this nullification thing was exercised often. In fact, it cost Daniel Webster, the presidency. He thought he was going to be president. Anyway, that's another story. It was taught at West Point. And there's examples today. The Real ID Act is still playing out there, but the federal government says we're going to have a national ID card. And right now there's some states that are saying, no, we're not. Anyway, there's been other courts have ignored it. There's been things in the Slave Act we've talked about. Here's an example, regardless of your position about what cannabis should be. Any authorization of it's a violation of federal statute. It's this Controlled Substances Act of 1970. It's a Schedule I drug in which it's no accepted medical use and a high potential use for abuse, okay? It's under federal law, use, sale, and possession of all forms of cannabis in the United States is illegal. But 9 states have said, not in our state, okay? It's medical and recreational use. DC's legalized it. That's supposed to be a federal, wait a minute, okay, how did that happen? Congress is supposed to have some control there, I don't know. Legalized cannabis for personal use, not commercial sale. 31 states have legalized some degree of use of cannabis. 13 states have decriminalized it to some. This is in blatant violation of what we call federal law. And although they've never called it nullification, I have never seen a state that's done that. They're saying, not us, we're not going to go along with this. And by the way, the national government has no authority regarding the criminality of cannabis. Except Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution says Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, so they can interdict it at the border if they so choose. But they have no authority whatsoever for its criminality within the United States based upon, well, I'll just read you something Tucker said. I won't read the whole thing because I know we're running out of time. Dang it. All felonies and offenses, this is too much fun to set down, people. I mean, really, we're on such strong ground with these principles, foundational principles, not just nullification. And the only reason we're losing these things is because of ignorance and apathy. And we'll talk in a minute about what Jefferson said about that. But anyway, all felonies and offenses committed upon land, in all cases not expressly enumerated, being reserved to the states respectively. There's no criminality that the federal government has any authority over, except for, you could say, okay, well, let's see now. We got this thing about counterfeiting. Yeah, okay, counterfeiting. Copyrights. Oh, yeah. Your list is very short. Go look at it. There's no federal authority in any other area, okay, for the crimes. So Congress, court, and executive branch have usurped it. It's time we reinstituted this idea, okay? And we're going to avoid going to a convention if we can do this, because the convention could open us up to any number of terrible things. And if you think your idea is the only one that's out there, you got another thing coming. You think you got this grand and glorious thing that they've sold to you, I guarantee there's 100 other ones out there that you would probably gag on, I'm telling you. And we don't have to put our whole Constitution at risk. Nullification. Okay, we're going to use the words of the Founding Fathers, Jefferson, Madison, and here's what Jefferson said about education. If we can educate ourselves about the truth, about proper government and limits and bounds, we'll be okay. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, expects what never was and never will be. We're ignorant and we're not going to be free. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but in the people themselves. So we've got to enlighten the people about this, the final sentence. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. So Madison and Jefferson collaborated with Virginia and Kentucky on these Alien and Sedition Acts. Kentucky resolution was adopted by the legislature in November, Virginia in December, and we've read you some of this part right here. Holy cow, you're going to have to go back and read this. One thing I'm going to do is a handout. So here we come down. Here's where there's a rub. Some people that propose nullification do not understand the principle and wish to apply it in the wrong way. And so what Jefferson and Madison carefully outlined is, what do you do if when a delegated power is abused? Okay, so that was the whole rub with the South Carolina thing with the tariffs, because the tariff responsibility had been delegated to the United States Congress. And so they were using nullification wrongly, and that's why Madison was so opposed to it. But here's what was said. In cases of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, changed by the people, would be the constitutional remedy. So what's the constitutional solution? Vote the abusers out of power for delegated powers that are being abused. What about undelegated powers that are usurped? But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. That every state has a natural right, in cases not within the compact, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of power by others within their limits. That without this right they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whomsoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. So, undelegated powers, when they usurp them, state nullification is the idea. The officers in the United States government are creatures of the contract. They were created. They can't constitutionally, arbitrarily, unilaterally redefine their power. They were created by the contract. And they're in certain divided and subdivided subsets. The states are the parties to the contract. They're the guys that wrote the contract. They're the signatories on the contract. So they're the makers of it. The creature, when it gets out of control, out of the contract, the parties to the contract, the states, have got to re-engage. Okay? And it's time to rein in the usurping creatures of the contract, the national government. And it's time for the states to again apply the sound doctrine of nullification. Okay, so the states can begin to nullify unconstitutional actions of the United States government. And the generic form that I've given you here could be applied, and the states are invited to ask other states to engage in this with them. And as I pointed out, there are some that aren't calling it nullification that are already doing it. And the one example I used that was pretty widespread right now, and will probably end up in a national change in the cannabis issue, is something that's just as a formula, if you will. Jefferson said, single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day. How many times, some of you may remember Vietnam. Okay, I remember every time we did anything, it was like the enemy already knew about it. It was like somebody told them, and I found out later they did. I have State Department letters that say they informed the United Nations Security Council before every major action that happened in Southeast Asia. How many of my friends died because of that? Somebody was doing this on purpose. And that's exactly what's happening here with what's happening at the national level. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day. but a series of oppressions began at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, too plainly prove a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. We are losing to the centralization of every single aspect of power, and Jefferson and Madison both warned us that when that happens, we will be under an oppression far worse than it ever was under the king. Okay? So anyway, I've got this generic nullification resolution. You can have it if you want. And do I have time left for a question or two? No, forget it. You guys don't have any questions. Sorry, maybe he does. And he does.
I'm Al Fisher, and I'm so glad you gave us this educational program on the Constitution. I just want to remind everybody that in these new AAPS handbags, there is a copy of the Constitution at the bottom that you can study. And one of the shocking things I've found out is that law students don't study the Constitution in law school. I'm trying to find out if this is really true. And
it is absolutely true, and I can't tell you how many graduates of law schools have come up to me and says, "Why didn't I learn this in law school?" Well, you'll have to ask them, but you know what? You're going to have to learn it on your own because it's well documented. I can prove every way to Sunday and then beyond the facts of the matter.
And this is one of the ways that we really need to get the Constitution back in force is by having law students learn about it.
Yes.
I learned it in law school. And Scott, I just want to thank you so much. This has just been one of the best talks on the Constitution.
Thank you. All of you.